We're off.
New technology baffles pissed old hack. That was the
Hello everyone.
thanks very much for the invitation to come to Derby and meet with you. And I think it's really important that discussions such as these are taking place. I was in Bristol yesterday at a meeting of a little bit bigger than this, about 50 people come to discuss what's going on with Brexit from a socialist point of view. And of course, what we also know happened yesterday was we had the biggest march, anti-democracy march that's ever taken place in London, with Chuck Ramuna and Anna Soubry and Alistair Campbell and various other representatives of the establishment marching through London demanding that the votes of 17.5 million people should be annulled, and that they should get the chance to make us either vote again, or actually they've stopped calling for a second referendum to a great extent now. Their new demand is simply to revoke Article 50, which basically just means you can tear your votes up. And I think that it's a really important moment for this country and for particularly people of a socialist persuasion to understand exactly what is going on, because there's no doubt that there is a political crisis. You can see that happening every day of the week in Westminster, and to a certain extent people are rather bored of hearing whether Theresa May is going to come back for a third time or a fourth time with another version of her Brexit in name only, her Bruno deal, and the various crises afflicting the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, the breakaway group, this independent group, which Chuck Ramuna and Chris Leslie and Anna Soubry have set up. That, to a certain extent, is boring people. What you get, I think, to a great extent for the people I speak to, people who I work with and in my community, is they just sort of say, we need to get on with it. That's become a kind of mantra that you hear from a lot of people. We just need to get on with it and get out of the EU. So I think for socialists, for communists, those of us on the left, it's really important to understand that this isn't just a political crisis at a Westminster level. This is a profound crisis for the British ruling class, and so it goes beyond Westminster. This is about a much more structural crisis of the British state. It's a crisis of British capitalism and British imperialism and the strategies that the British ruling class have had at their disposal for the last 40 years in order to maintain their domination over the working class in this country and peoples in many other countries as well, where British capitalists make their profits. So I want to talk kind of a little bit more generally about what's underlying this crisis and what I think we need to conclude from it. But we're probably also going to have a discussion about things like the ridiculous position that the Labour Party seems to have got itself into at the moment, where you have front bench Labour shadow spokespersons, for example, advocating that the manifesto of the Labour Party in the next general election should advocate a second referendum, and that Labour should commit to supporting a Remain position in any second referendum. You can't think of, I don't know what people in Derby, how they would view that, if that manifesto popped through their letterbox, or Nottingham, or other places in the East Midlands, but I can tell you that it's a massive vote loser with the people that I work with and the people in my community, and it would be a suicide manifesto to all intents and purposes. So we can talk about the Labour Party and what's going on with the internal machinations between Tom Watson and supporters of Jeremy Corbyn and Momentum and various other factions a bit later, but I think we need to look fundamentally at the underlying class politics of what this Brexit crisis represents. So first of all, we've seen a few weeks ago the emergence, a breakaway from the Labour Party with this new group, the independent group so-called, 11, at the time of counting, 11 MPs who have set up not a political party but a private company apparently, so they don't have to declare their financial accounts. The big money backers behind it include prominent former Tory funders, but also people connected with the financial services industries. Chuck Ramuna is one MP in particular with close connections to financial services. And I think it's worth remarking as well that up until this point, the mainstream media in this country seems remarkably incurious as to the source of the financial backing, the very substantial financial backing behind this breakaway group of MPs. However, in reality, 11 MPs who were clearly out and out neoliberals, breaking away from the Labour Party and the Tory Party to form a small group, is just a very minor matter. It's a matter of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, effectively. The big questions I think that we need to look at are what's happening to the British ruling class's strategy in a more general sense. So that means we need to go back a little bit and look at what's happened in the last 2.5 years since the June 23rd, 2016 referendum vote to leave the European Union. In the days immediately following the referendum, you will recall the value of the pound weakened on currency exchanges, and various political commentators were stumbling around, shocked and dazed, and saying things like, "But I don't know anyone who voted leave. How could this have happened?" It was something of a shock to the City of London, to the political commentators, to the political establishment. It was seen as being not just a catastrophe, but an unforeseen catastrophe, which it really shouldn't have been, because anyone who had their ear to the ground knew that there was a very substantial body of opinion in this country which has never reconciled itself to either the membership of the European Union or the concept of being ruled by an organisation which is based on treaties rather than based on representative democracy. And I want to just first of all make a sharp distinction between the form of government that the EU represents, the form of proto-superstate that the EU represents, and the form of government that bourgeois parliamentary democracy in this country represents. So the EU is defined by its treaties. The Treaty of Lisbon, the Treaty on the European Union, the fundamental treaties which form the EU are interstate arrangements which cannot be altered without the agreement of all of the other parties, all of the other states involved. So to that extent, they sit above representative democracy. They are constitutional arrangements that mean that, for example, no matter what government is elected in Britain or France or Germany or Belgium, it is unlawful under these treaties to carry out certain acts. For example, to prevent the free movement of capital, goods, services and labour, the four freedoms, so-called, of the EU. And to that extent, it represents a different form of state government from the form of state government which the British ruling class decided on and agreed to as a result of the struggles in our history, the English Revolution and Civil War of the 17th century, the struggles of the 18th and 19th century around extending suffrage. Those struggles were a struggle for political rights and freedoms by people who didn't have them, namely people without a property qualification, working class people, women. But there were also struggles to have influence in the Parliament. And it was all about having influence in the Parliament rather than having influence in a Supreme Court or in a treaty interpreting or treaty making body. And what the EU represents is a different type of political formation and political dominance. It is a political dominance that is which has had the democratic element extracted from it. It is an interstate, treaty-based form of government. What we see throughout the 19th century, as the franchise in this country is expanded from 1832, 1867, 1868, I think, I can't remember if 1867, the Second Great Reform Act, in the 1880s, the Third Great Reform Act. What you see there is a series of bargains which the British ruling class made in order to negotiate with these new groups of electors who have been brought into the franchise. And as they have to develop a language and a form of political narrative to adapt to these new voters, you see the development of new forms of political ideology emerging in this country. So, for example, working class Toryism coming out of particularly the Second Great Reform Act in the second half of the 19th century, working class liberalism, the promise of cheap bread through free trade, which was the great appeal that the Liberal Party of the 19th century had to working class people, the playing of things like the orange card in Ireland and also in cities in this country with Irish populations or populations coming from Ireland. Home rule at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, which was the Liberals' attempt to outflank the Conservative Unionists. And then around the beginning of the 20th century, of course, the emergence of a mass Labour Party based on the trade union movement, with an organic connection to these new mass organisations of workers. And all of these new political ideologies and political labels and political movements were effectively a reflection of the need of the people who ran the country, the ruling class, to create and find a new compact, a new way of dealing with people who have been brought into the franchise. And that process really went on through much of the 20th century, leading to, for example, the 1945 Labour government, which it was a pro-imperialist government. Let's be clear. It authorised the Cheveling programme, the first research into British nuclear weapon. It authorised imperialist counterinsurgency operations, so-called, in Malaya, in Kenya, in many other countries that were former British colonies. But it was also able to offer workers here a significant improvement in their social conditions. The creation of the National Health Service, the nationalisation of some of the commanding heights of the economy, shipbuilding, railways, etc., the coal industry. I'm not going to repeat the achievements of the 1945 Labour government, you're all aware of them. But this process begins to break down in the 1970s. And of course, the reason it begins to break down is that the new ideology of the ruling class worldwide, and in particular the American ruling class, is becoming the ideology of neoliberalism. And the key distinction and difference of the neoliberals compared to previous ruling class strategists was to understand that it was necessary to remove from the democratic debate, from the parliamentary sphere, from the representative sphere, huge areas of political discussion, and turn them into technical issues to be run either by technocrats or by bankers or by people who were remote from democratic influence and democratic control and accountability. And so the neoliberal era opens in the 1970s, famously in terms of our own British political history. You have the Dennis Healey, the then Labour Chancellor, having to go to the IMF for a bailout loan in 1976. The condition of the loan was that he had to restrict public spending, had to start cutting public spending in a way that Labour governments had resisted doing to a great extent before that. The repercussions inside the Labour Party were that there was a sharp political split between those on the left who sought to maintain a position of independence from the diktats of the IMF, and those realists around the Labour leadership of the time, particularly around Healey, who argued that the only way in which Britain could stabilise its economy, get itself out of the crisis, was through following the diktats of the International Monetary Fund. But that was one aspect of what was a worldwide turn in political strategy by ruling classes all over the world. It was an example, a very clear example, of where a democratic question is being turned into a question of managerialism. And this is what particularly identifies and typifies the neoliberals' approach to politics. And so the reason I want to mention that is because I think it's very significant in terms of where we are at the moment. Sorry, I'm just kind of skipping back and forth a little bit through this paper which I wrote a few weeks ago. So since the mid-1980s, the historically unprecedented situation had pertained where the working classes in England, Wales and Scotland have had no mass political party able or willing to advocate their interests at a time of global economic restructuring measures driven by international institutions such as the IMF, which I mentioned, the World Bank, and increasingly since 1992, driven by the European Central Bank through the single currency, the euro, which, although Britain is not a member, still affects Britain because it came about as a result of the Maastricht Treaty, and the Maastricht convergence criteria applies to all EU member states, irrespective of whether they're a member of the single currency or whether, like Britain or Denmark or Sweden or nowadays Poland, they're not a member of the single currency. Irrespective of whether you have the euro, your government expenditure under the Maastricht criteria is constrained to 60% of GDP. So you are not allowed to borrow against your GDP beyond a ratio of 60%. And this has been used for people who think that austerity began in 2009, 2010, following the bailout of the British, French and German banks. That's not true. The EU's commitment to austerity went back a long time before that. It went back to really the tight money policy and the ordoliberal strategy advocated by the Germans at the time of the Maastricht Treaty. What upset this, as far as we're concerned, was the unexpected election in September 2015 of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party. And 6 months later, or a little bit more than 6 months later, the massive vote to leave the European Union in June 2016. So this exploded all of the assumptions about the British political system and how it was run and the rules that it could be run under, which the ruling class had relied on. And it did so at a particularly dangerous time for British capitalism. It did so at a time when the election of Donald Trump in the United States showed the vulnerability and the lack of legitimacy of the so-called rules-based New World Order, which had been put in place by Bill Clinton and subsequently the Bushes. Trump was arguing from a different playbook. Trump was arguing in favour of economic protectionism, something which was anathema to all of the previous generations of neoliberal world leaders. And of course, I think we should be reminded in this situation of Lenin's dictum that for a revolution to take place, it is usually insufficient for the lower classes not to want to live in the old way. It is also necessary that the upper classes should be unable to rule in the old way. And what we're perhaps seeing on a world scale at the moment is that the upper classes, the ruling classes, are unable to rule in the old way. We're seeing signs in some countries that the lower classes, the working classes, are refusing to live in the old way, but it's uneven, it's patchy, and I would argue there's no clear indication, we can't be confident that the working classes are going to understand that this is an opportunity to achieve social advances which were the social advances of socialism. There are people waiting in the wings, advocating various populist strategies from the right, and therefore the need for clarity amongst socialists and the need for action around clear, achievable, definable goals by socialists to support working class revolts against the breakdown of ruling class order are very, very important. They are the order of the day. This is what we have to do, and this is what, at the moment, we're struggling to do. So what are the class interests that confront each other in the current British political crisis sparked by the Brexit debate? Well, I'll want to concentrate or focus on one particular example, which I think is useful for us to consider. So there was the announcement by the Japanese car maker Honda in February last month that it's going to shut its car plant in Swindon at the end of 2021 when the current run of production finishes. And that's going to lead to a loss of about 7,000 jobs and further job losses cascading from that. And people in Derby will be very aware, you know, of how the supply chain of jobs is affected when a major manufacturer closes. We've had the struggles in Derby over the Lichfield Lane plant a few years ago, and I was up here with my union and other unions and the Derby Trades Council marching to save Derby rail jobs back then. And I think, you know, inevitably supporters of Britain remaining in the EU made a great deal of over the Honda announcement in the days following it, and indeed blamed the decision that Honda had taken on the vote to leave the European Union, the Brexit vote 2 years earlier. Honda responded saying that the decision was due to global changes in the car industry, in particular the need to phase out diesel engines. It's a diesel engine plant in Swindon, and to concentrate more on electric engines. The fact that their main markets are not in Europe, they don't sell that many cars in Europe. Most of the units that they shift are in the United States and in China, and they wanted to be nearer to their markets. And indeed, I would say that the decision that Honda took, in fact, is connected to the Brexit debate, but not in the way that supporters of the European Union mean. In reality, the Honda announcement came about just 2 weeks after the entry into force of the new Japan-EU free trade agreement. Now, this is an agreement that's been negotiated for the last 3 or 4 years. The Financial Times reported 2 years ago in July 2017. I'll just read you an extract from the FT article because I think it's quite illuminating. EU strikes trade deal with Japan. Tokyo opens up agricultural goods. Brussels opens up to Japanese cars. That was the headline. So they go on to say in the actual article that this is the accord reached after 4 years of talks will remove tariffs from 99% of goods traded between the EU and Japan, although in certain cases transition periods will apply. The EU and Japan have also agreed to open up their public procurement, so that's all the council services, government outsourcing, open up their public procurement markets to each other, and to remove some non-tariff trade barriers. As long as China and the US are off the table, this is basically the biggest free trade agreement that Europe can pursue. And they quote an anonymous senior European Union official saying, "We will have full duty-free access for almost all agri-food exports, which would include pasta, confectionery and chocolate. We will have full for Japan, the main success is an agreement for the EU to remove barriers to the imports of cars. So we get to send them pasta and chocolate. They get to send us high-value engineering products. Now, the people who negotiated this obviously didn't have the interests of workers in the car industry in Swindon at heart. That's hardly a surprise to anyone in this room. But the important thing about the Japan-EU Free Trade Agreement is that it sticks a hole underneath the waterline of the industrial policy, or what passes for an industrial policy, of all neoliberal governments in Britain, Conservative and Labour and Lib Dem, when they were in government, for the last 35 years. So ever since the Thatcher era, the holy grail of neoliberal industrial policy is foreign direct investment. That is to persuade Japanese, German, American banks and corporations to invest their capital in this country, in a plant, and you do that by offering them tax breaks, you build them infrastructure, you provide training courses for workers to make sure that they're suitably trained, you provide all sorts of blandishments to make sure that the corporation comes to your country, then they build their product in your country, then the reason they do it, apart from the bribes, is that they can sell into the European market. That was the premise on which we went into the European Union. The idea was that we would have access to the European market in a way that countries outside the European Union did not have access to the European market. That was the promise of the EEC, the Common Market. And after 1986, 1986 is a very significant year. Not only was it the aftermath of the miners' strike, when the Tories were inflicting major new punishment on the trade union movement in this country, it was also the year of the Big Bang in the City of London, when they deregulated financial services in the City of London, which was the signal for the world's biggest banks, the Citibanks, the Nomura's, all of the big banks you've heard of, Morgan Stanley, to come into the City of London and base their operations in Canary Wharf or other parts of the City of London so that they could have a portal into the European market. What also happened that year in 1986 was the signing of the Single European Act. The Single European Act was negotiated. I mean, people often say that the EU is a partnership or a conspiracy between German capitalists and French farmers. The 1986 Single European Act showed that that is not the case. The Single European Act was negotiated between Margaret Thatcher and Helmut Kohl, and it put a completely new complexion on the class strategy of the European Union. Britain was to provide the majority of financial services from the City of London. In return, Germany was to provide the majority of industrial products, industrial manufactured products, and that was the basis on which both countries signed up to the Single European Act. The Single European Act introduced the rules of the single market, which we're currently talking about today in the context of the Brexit debate. So it's a very, very important period. What the Japan-EU Free Trade Agreement, which has just come into force last month in February, shows is that the assumptions behind the Single European Act no longer apply in many respects. So a Japanese company, Honda, can base itself in Japan, it can base itself in a special economic zone in China, it can base itself in Singapore, it can base itself in California. It can produce goods and it can import them duty-free, tariff-free into the European market. There is no need to have a factory in Swindon or Sunderland or anywhere else in this country any longer. So this really removes one of the essential pillars behind the arguments that were put for us joining the European Union in the first place, and it's a major realignment and it's a major reorientation of the strategy of the global ruling class in respect of Britain and the EU. And I think for this reason, one of the most important events that took place last year that was really not covered by the mainstream media, other than in a few passing articles, was the speech that Jeremy Corbyn gave in Coventry, and which was then later repeated in Birmingham in February and then July of 2018. And Jeremy's speech was addressing the question of what happens in this country when capital leaves, when there's capital flight. And you remember, free movement of capital is one of the 4 pillars, one of the constitutional pillars of the European Union. What he said in July in Birmingham was part of Labour's so-called Build It in Britain campaign. He said, the next Labour government will not just sit back and manage the ongoing decline of swathes of our economy. We can and must make a difference. That's why we will use the state to actively intervene in the economy, to create as much wealth as possible and, crucially, to ensure that wealth is shared fairly between everybody in our society. Experts call this an industrial strategy. Now, the speech is quite a long one. It's on the Labour Party website. I would recommend people read it. It's very, very interesting, because what he's talking about there in a great deal of detail is state investment in research and development, in long-term manufacturing objectives, in recreating a manufacturing sector in this country, based around universities, based around higher education, based around good jobs with trade union recognition. It's all in the speech. It's a very, very progressive speech, and it makes the basic case for an alternative economic strategy for the next Labour government. Of course, the speech was almost immediately deluged and wiped off through a series of internal attacks on Corbyn, particularly the attacks on Corbyn himself and on others on the left of the Labour Party around the question of anti-Semitism. We then saw really the headlines for the remainder of the late summer and autumn very much dominated, the talk about the Labour Party, very much dominated by the internal battles over these allegations and smears of anti-Semitism, from which you could argue the party has not really recovered. I mean, these are still ongoing, and for example, Chris Williamson from Derby North is the latest victim of one of these appalling smears and has been shamefully suspended from membership of the Parliamentary Labour Party for a speech he gave in Sheffield, which was, I mean, I challenge. It was not a. Well, to say it was not a racist speech makes it sound as though you're kind of being defensive about it. It was an anti-racist speech, talking about a strategy for how Labour ought to reclaim its tradition of anti-racism and anti-fascism and deal with accusations properly of anti-Semitism, and where they're found to be true, deal with anti-Semites who are in their party by expelling them. So this internal civil war that's been going on for the last year in the Labour Party around the question of anti-Semitism has no doubt weakened Corbyn and those around him. But there have been other mistakes, I think, that the leadership of the Labour Party have made. And I'm not including Corbyn in this, but it's very noticeable that I think perhaps the most significant tactical error was at the party conference last September, where the trade unions, led by Unite, failed to support the constituency association, the constituency Labour Party delegates who voted in favour of trigger ballots to re-elect sitting Labour MPs. And because the trade unions didn't support that, what it led to was a lot of MPs who hate Corbyn, hate his politics, and want to do everything they can to destroy him, having been let off the leash to do as much damage as they can, because they know that their constituencies cannot discipline them, or it becomes much more difficult for their constituencies to discipline them. And of course this led directly also to the ridiculous position that Labour has got itself into over advocating a second referendum, something which Jeremy Corbyn doesn't support, but which has been openly touted by Keir Starmer, Emily Thornberry and many other leading members of the shadow front bench. So I'm kind of coming to a sort of conclusion now, you'll be glad to hear. I'm not sure if it's a clear conclusion, but I started off by saying that I think we need to look at the class politics underlying the stuff on the surface, the froth on the surface, the various small groups of MPs manoeuvring in Parliament for various different positions. And I think that what's going on under the surface is pointed to by this quote from the Financial Times columnist Wolfgang Munchau, and he's argued recently in an article entitled What Britain Should Do After a No-Deal Brexit that the UK needs to draw up a post-industrial economic strategy for the long term. And he says the following: the rentier business model, in other words, the business model where, which we're all part of now, where you borrow from the bank to own your own home. You work with people who have probably got mortgages on a second home as well, and they're renting it out to someone else. Is you have a whole structured economy where everyone is depending on income from rent. The rentier business model has, I believe, been one of the deeper reasons behind the Brexit vote. With the single market in financial services, you remember the single market in financial services which came out of the 1986 Single European Act. With the single market in financial services, the UK has become the Eurozone's financial centre. It was a profitable niche, but the British economy has in the process become too dependent on finance. Brexit offers an opportunity to rebalance. So for the left and the trade union movement as well in Britain, we have got an opportunity here which we seem determined to waste. You'll have seen this past week the TUC issued a joint statement with the CBI calling for effectively a second referendum and the prevention of a no-deal Brexit at all costs. The TUC, which purports to speak on behalf of 6.5 million workers and claims actually that it speaks on behalf of many other workers who are not in trade unions in their interests. We've got a Labour Party which seems determined to shoot itself in both feet, and we've got a working class constituency of voters who've been absolutely resolute for the last 2.5 years, despite condemnations in posh newspapers, despite being called knuckle draggers, racists, and various other slanders that have been made on people who voted to leave the European Union. Opinion polls show that, if anything, support for leaving the European Union is hardening, not weakening, amongst voters in this country, and that includes to a great extent working class people. The last opinion poll that came out yesterday, I think it was, I saw showed that following that yesterday's march, they took an opinion poll. Comres, the major opinion poll company, took a poll which showed that 34% of those asked said they would support remaining in the EU, and over 50%, the highest ever recorded, are now in favour of leaving the EU under any terms whatsoever. So I think we need to base ourselves, and I'll finish on this, around some just key basic principles and try and work out how we apply those principles in the campaigns that we're all part of. First, we need to say the people have spoken. There's been a people's vote. It was in June 2016, and a majority of over 1 million decided that the UK should leave the EU. Election results need to be implemented, not cancelled by the losers. Secondly, we need to talk openly and talk to working class people about reclaiming popular sovereignty. This is a phrase that seems, it's a bit of an odd phrase. People aren't perhaps used to using the phrase popular sovereignty. You hear people talk about national sovereignty sometimes, or sovereignty, but popular sovereignty is the sovereignty of the people. It's the people who give the legitimacy to the institutions. That is what all popular revolutions decide. That is what the Irish decided in their proclamation in 1916. Power and legitimacy rests on the people, and we need to reassert the legitimacy of popular sovereignty. That means we need to be calling for a people's Brexit that reaffirms the right of people to decide their own future, not dependent on treaties between other states, or between Britain and other states, or the permission of other states, or the permission of constitutional courts in Strasbourg or anywhere else, but based on the decisions of the people. And we should be welcoming the return of over 100 decision-making powers that will be coming back from Brussels when we leave, and we'll be going to devolved governments in Scotland and Wales and regional. We should be demanding regional governments in England that can use devolved powers, the same devolved powers that are used in Scotland and Wales. And we won't be able to get our hands on those powers unless we leave the EU. One of the extraordinary ironies of the current political debate in this country is that the Scottish Nationalist Party leader was on a march in London yesterday demanding a second referendum and that we shouldn't leave the EU. When we leave the EU, 65 new pieces of statutory legislation will come into the power of the Scottish Parliament. It will directly empower the Scottish Parliament, and the leader of the Scottish Nationalist Party is opposed to that. Plaid Cymru in Wales, adamantly opposed to Brexit and to leaving the EU, despite the fact that a majority of voters in Wales voted to leave the EU, and a very large majority of their own supporters in working class constituencies in the valleys. It's a bizarre situation. We need to reclaim the concept of popular sovereignty and make it popular. We need to call for a general election now. A few weeks ago, I wrote an article, or a letter actually, in the Morning Star after a rather daft comment piece by somebody who said that calling for a general election was just an unreasonable demand. Well, a general election is now the favourite at the bookies. You go down William Hill, you'll see that they're offering odds. It's getting very close to evens on a general election. So things are changing very fast. There's going to be a general election very soon, and we've got to make sure that when that general election happens, Labour doesn't go into it with a suicidal manifesto promising a second referendum, and in the event that there is a second referendum, they're going to support remaining in the European Union, which is what a lot of their leadership would in fact want to do. We need to be arguing for the left and progressive policies that we all argue for in our campaign groups, in our unions, in our political parties. And the only way that those can be implemented is if a Labour government is elected and is freed from the shackles of the European Union single market and the customs union. We need to invest, as Jeremy Corbyn wants to, in mending what they rather patronisingly call broken Britain. We need to invest in rebuilding a manufacturing sector in this country. Those are the high value jobs that we need. Those are the jobs that our kids need. Those are the jobs that involved higher education, that involved giving people something creative to do with their working lives. And those are the jobs that have been exported to low wage economies. We need full rights, campaign for full rights for all workers in place of the EU-backed super exploitation of migrant workers. Labour markets ought to be regulated by collective bargaining and progressive legislation, and we should argue to repeal Britain's racist nationality and immigration laws, which were brought in, well, the latest version of which were brought in by Theresa May when she was the Home Office. And finally, we need to talk explicitly about rejecting the militarisation of the EU. Britain has to withdraw from EU military structures, programmes, and take steps towards an independent foreign policy and defence policy based on social justice, peace and solidarity. I think those are some key ideas and slogans and that we can take forward. But we have to first of all understand the critical situation that we're in. You know, we're on the brink of either a great opportunity or a major catastrophe and a step back if we find that both the Conservative Party, the Establishment Party and the Labour Party are able to turn their back on the popular vote of 17.5 million people and tell them that we're ripping it up, your votes don't matter. That will be the circumstances in which the opportunity for a mass party of the far right will certainly take a big, big upswing. And I'll finish on that. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Alex. And